Right, welcome everyone. I'm definitely very excited to be here with you today. Definitely the most fancy stage I've ever been on, so I do apologize if I say something silly. But yes, welcome to my talk. Is my code doing good? So, tech industry and climate change. A few words about me. My name is Pat, as I said. I'm a codebar Edinburgh organizer, so hello to everybody from Scotland if you're watching. I work as a front-end developer at a company called Silvera. And I am a career changer. So I actually started my coding journey with codebar, and I then gradually sort of got to being an organizer. And it is my first time sort of speaking, giving a public talk, so thank you for the opportunity to also trying that out. I have a degree in carbon management, and throughout my professional journey, I have worked in sustainability-related companies as well as the clean tech. So I think it's fair to say that climate change as a problem has been quite close to my heart for quite some time. And so I have made quite a few personal choices to reflect that. I've done all of this. I looked at recycling. I sort of considered the environmental impact of my diet. Think of sustainable transport choices. I'm energy efficient. I also decided to only work for sustainability companies, let's say, if you want to call it that way. So long story short, I sort of thought I was doing quite okay, right? I was really thinking about the environmental impact of my life. And then I don't remember if it was a talk I saw or a presentation, but somebody was really trying to make a point of the fact that the emissions of a full-time digital employee could be higher or very much comparable to the emissions of a single household. And obviously you can ask a lot of questions about this quote, about this equation, I suppose. People work in different ways and households have different sizes, so I wouldn't sort of quote this on a scientific paper. But truth to be told, it has made me realize that I know very little about the impact of the tech industry. I know very little about the impact of the industry I worked quite hard to be a part of. And all of these questions sort of started building up in my head, and this is how we are here. This is how the idea for this talk came about. So what are we going to cover today? Just to say, I really tried to make this talk sort of beginner, sort of entry-level, junior developers friendly. And what we'll be talking about is the why should you care? Why is climate change even a problem you should be concerning yourself about? The good, so the positive impact of our industry. The not so good, I guess, the bad, the negative impact of the tech industry. And also a few practical points that you might take away today with you to reduce your carbon footprint as a developer. What we are not going to talk about today, however, just to make it very clear, I'm not going to go sort of in depth into any sort of climate science details. Not going to run any carbon footprinting calculations versus lines of code to give you those comparisons. And if you know what geoengineering is, I'm not going to be talking about that either. Okay? So a lot to cover, so let's get started. So why should you care about climate change? So climate change affects everyone, really. However, climate impacts are not fairly distributed, and they will disproportionately affect different people depending on where you live. Depending on where you are based, your community might be already experiencing climate change impacts, although maybe your community hasn't necessarily done the most to cause it. It has negative impact on health and food systems. It will negatively affect the infrastructure. And unless we all act, it's all gonna get worse. So climate change, genuinely speaking, manifests itself through many signs. Some of the ones you might be mostly aware of are things like extreme weather events. So droughts, sea level rise, floods. All of this will be occurring at much higher rate and much more frequently. And all of this is caused by the greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases, just to be very clear, some of it is required in the atmosphere to keep sort of the temperature of the Earth at the livable temperature. But it is extremely clear and apparent that due to the humans' activity through burning fossil fuels mainly, is that we're emitting far too many of them. And this is how we're experiencing global warming. There is a few different global greenhouse gases. You might have heard about them. You have your carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, HFCs, PFCs. And what's important to know for the duration of this presentation is that different greenhouse gases sort of capture different amounts of heat, and they also stay in the atmosphere for a different period of time. So in order to be able to quantify sort of the emissions, we sort of came up with a unit, like a standard unit called CO2e, so it's carbon dioxide equivalent. So when we'll be talking about calculations, we'll be talking about emissions through this presentation, that's the unit we're going to very often be using. So sort of understanding and let's say not disputing the fact that climate change is going to be affecting our weather events, a good question to ask ourselves is our industry resilient to all of that? Are the products and services, will they be able to run, especially at the times and places when people need them most? Are the websites we're building, are they resilient enough to issues? A great example, I think it was in 2017, CNN, when the Hurricane Emma, I think Hurricane Emma has hit, they released this ultralight version of their website just so that people who have very limited access to internet and broadband could read all of the news they needed. Can your software do that? So also in the light of extreme weather events, it's also quite apparent that data centers, the very data centers that are homes to the servers that we need to run our software, are also facing some challenges. So they are competing for water. Data centers are using a lot of water resources for cooling. In the areas that are prone to drought, where the water resources are scarce, will they be able to cope? Sea level rise could overwhelm cables and other data transmission infrastructure as well. Apparently, I saw that statistic that apparently roughly 3.3 gigawatts of data center capacity in the US is recognized risk zone for hurricanes. And just last year, Google and Oracle's data centers experienced cooling failures during the heat wave that we experienced in the UK. Now, this is the sort of map of London in 2050, and the sort of red zone is the projected flood area. You see sort of London Docklands, which is pretty much, I guess, home of the center of UK's internet infrastructure. A lot of data centers in there as well. Will they be able to cope with those weather conditions? Maybe they will. I'm not pointing fingers, by the way, at anybody. Maybe they have a very strong resilience plan in place. Just sort of making a point. So what's the bad? And by the bad, I mean just not so positive impact, I suppose. So when I was preparing this segment of the talk, I really just wanted to look for some statistics just to understand a little bit more what's the impact of the industry on the environment and what sort of resources are they using. And I hope you'll find some of them interesting as well. So now, depending where you look, between 2 to 4% is being estimated as the ICT's industry carbon emissions globally, which actually in the grander scale of things is a pretty decent chunk. I found somewhere a number that it might grow to 14% by 2040. I haven't quite found the maths behind it to justify it, so don't quote that number, but that's what I found. I don't know if there are any sort of fans of ChatGPT. Has anybody tried it recently? Well, I saw a very interesting article that basically compared it and said that just to run it in January, it has used the equivalent electricity of 175,000 people, which is quite a lot, really. A lot of electricity to run it. Dark data. Dark data is essentially a data that organizations or individuals are storing for operational purposes, but it's actually never being used by anyone. Like, it's dumped in the database and it just lives there rent-free. And apparently it's equivalent of 6.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent just to be doing nothing, which is a lot. Now, I don't know if people still need convincing about the fact that to mine Bitcoin, that's a very energy-intensive process. But in case you do, again, I found a very interesting comparison, and it is equivalent of 11 years of running all kettles in the UK non-stop, a lot of cups of tea. Idle servers, we might say our servers are fine because they aren't running. If you have a server that isn't running, even at its idle state, it's wasting around 470 kilograms of CO2e per year. I don't know if anybody's sort of looking into machine learning. If it's a very new concept to you, don't worry about it. But it can take up to, not always, this is just an example, it can take up to lifetime emissions of 5 cars to train a single neutral network model. Hopefully it's teaching you something if you're doing that. Now, 2% of global electricity is being consumed by the data centers alone, and that is expected to grow to 8% by 2030. I found out a very interesting article as well that said that there is 350 million active websites currently on the internet. There was another comparison saying that about 82% of all of the websites altogether are inactive. Lots of resources used just to run inactive websites. I couldn't find math behind it, so I didn't put that on the slide either. But just something to think about. That includes obviously all of your WordPresses, your Squarespaces, things you build for yourself. But it's a vast resource. And apparently a new one is built every 3 seconds. It's a lot of websites. So as I sort of go, I just wanted to flag, I got this slide from the Green Software Foundation. I'll be covering that organization in a little bit in this presentation, but this is not my slide. I just wanted to say that as I ran through all of these stats, you sort of see the electricity and the emissions and how does it all link. So obviously, when I say something has a certain amount of emissions, that's the greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere. When I talk about electricity, one thing we need to understand is we don't necessarily know if the electricity we use to power our computers, our data centers, where is that electricity coming from? And what this slide is trying to show is that very often it might be not a renewable source of energy. It might be a dirty energy, so your oil or coal, and that is obviously having a big contribution to climate change. Now, seeing that was a bit sad, let's move on to sort of the good, so the positive impact. And it's indisputable, absolutely indisputable that sort of technology is a big, accelerator of climate action. It's helping us also fight it. Particularly sort of clean tech sector, so companies that are sort of, their purpose is to fight climate change, let's say it like that, is seeing a massive increase. And actually, recruiters are saying that is one of the sectors that we do see with a tremendous long-term promise. So if you're looking into getting into coding, it's very likely you might land a job on one of the clean tech companies, which is, I guess, sad a little bit, but also quite great that you can play a role in that. So what I'm going to do is, in the first instance, just run a few examples of very interesting companies and how they tackle climate change. A great example, for example, is block heating. They are locating clusters of data centers in different locations, and they are making sure that the heat that would normally be wasted through the data center's operation, they reuse it for greenhouse gases and for buildings. I will talk a little bit about sort of hardware in a moment as well, but there's a company like Framework that is basically taking care of fixing computers and making sure that they're sort of built from sustainably sourced parts as well. So something maybe that we're not doing very often at the moment. We're just sort of tracking things away, don't we? There are industries that are producing a vast amount of data, and for them to be able to sort of quantify how environmentally damaging they are to the planet is very difficult. So companies like Emitwise, basically thanks to their machine learning software, are able to analyze all that data and output very interesting insights that maybe something that wouldn't be possible before. Thanks to technology, we're basically able to access, the satellite data imagery. Thanks to machine learning, we're able to uncover possibilities for mapping world's forests. It's insane. You can basically see, the patterns of trees How is the deforestation changing across the world? All of that thanks to technology, which is absolutely wonderful. And then you also have companies who are sort of taking advantage of all of that data, like NCX or Silvera, who are sort of trying to make sure that nature-based carbon offset projects are, measured and quantified properly. Technology is obviously also supporting other sectors to become more sustainable, like, for example, to avoid food waste, like Too Good To Go or Olio, if you have heard about them. They also help people travel more sustainably. Multiple applications that are working sort of in helping people finding more sustainable transport options. Technology also sort of tries to embed sustainable choices into our everyday life. Maybe you have seen it already. Google Maps have options to pick a eco-friendly route. If you're traveling, they have a live navigation site. I haven't tried it. It might be horrible, but live navigation for cyclists. And also they sort of point out where the bike sharing stations are. So maybe instead of hiring a car, you hire a bike, if you have thought about it. It's also about making data available. Technology is bridging gaps and bringing data that maybe we could have never accessed before, like data about climate that you can get from the NASA's climate change portal. Or data that can help us build our products more sustainably. I do apologize, the slide on the right is using color coding, but it's essentially flagging, how carbon intensive the current electricity grid is in each country. So this big black dot in the middle, that's Poland, where I'm from. We hugely rely on on coal, and this is why it's so dark. So if you're, for example, thinking of using data center in Poland, it's very likely it might be powered for coal. Now, sort of the practical. And I totally get that, if you're sort of you're starting your career, you're an entry-level developer or a junior developer, it might be daunting. And it might feel like it's too much because you're learning a lot and I'm sort of putting another idea in your head. Or maybe you feel like you're inadequate to even ask these questions. Like, come on, I've just started coding, what do I know? So I hope that I will be able to convince you that this is not true and that you can also ask questions. So if you're looking for inspiration or some ideas, I will flag 2 organizations to you. One of them is Green Software Foundation, and it's pretty much an initiative. They are looking to create an ecosystem of like standard tools, standard processes, and best practices really about how to write green software. That's your technical knowledge right there. Some of the things I'm just going to very quickly point out because I will run out of time. But the Awesome Green Software is a library full of resources. You name it, it's probably there. Lots of interesting ideas. The Aware SDK I will talk about in a little bit. And Green Software Patterns is like a catalog of sort of ideas how to write your code. Not only you can go into a catalog, find something around writing web code. These things can help you to structure your code in a little bit more optimized fashion. Not only will you reduce your emission as a software developer, you'll also become a better developer because all of these patterns are also very good in terms of how code should run. And they also have a green software training. During that training, they will teach you essentially how to build, how to maintain, and how to run software in a greener fashion. If that's too much at the beginning for you, just have a look, see if there are any sort of areas that interest you, come back to it in a year. Now, Climate Action to Tech is a slightly different organization. They are pretty much community-driven and community-based. They have this Slack, and if you join it, it's free to join, free for everybody. Lots of channels around different topics. Green software, carbon footprinting, design, you name it, it's probably also there. So if you're ever stuck, if you're looking for an idea, inspiration, there will be somebody there to help you. If you feel like it's too much for you, just ask. There's a lot of people already working on that problem. Okay, that's great. But what if you actually want to understand what makes a software green and you want to know a little bit more about it? So Green Software Foundation, again, just came up with this slide, and it just sort of suggests that carbon efficiency, sort of writing green software, relies on 3 pillars, and that's your energy efficiency, hardware efficiency, and carbon awareness. I'm going to briefly talk about 2 of them. So carbon awareness is this idea that we should understand that the electricity that we use to power our let's say data centers in this essence, is coming from different sources. It's not always clean, but it can also depend on where are we taking it from and at which time of the day. So this slide sort of explains you have those 2 top numbers in there. These numbers basically outline the carbon intensity of the electricity grid at any given time. So as you can see on the left, it can be fully powered by wind and solar, or I can see it on the right, it can be not. So if your organization, if sort of thinking, right, if we could only move some of our heavily running processes to run at the different time of the day, to be able to make sure that we take advantage of that low carbon intensity of the grid. Why can't we do that? It requires no changes to your code, no architectural decisions, choices to be made. So this is really carbon awareness. And Green Software Foundation, just very quickly, does have a tool that can help you to do that. They have this Carbon Aware SDK, and for people who don't know what SDK is, it's basically it's a software development toolkit. It's like a little package with lots of little functions, let's say, that you can use and manipulate to get the information that you want out of it. And they already do that. They give you this SDK that can help you get all of that data, so you can actually quite easily find out when you should run your processes. Very interesting. Now, hardware. So I haven't really talked about it yet, but hardware is a massive proxy for carbon. And as this slide is showing that for a lot of user devices, the embodied carbon, so the carbon that has been created as a result of sort of creation of the device, is very often higher than the emissions coming out of using it afterwards. So, what do we need to do? We need to stop throwing away our devices if possible and try to extend their lifespan. So for instance, if your laptop is 900 kilograms carbon equivalent to produce, if you keep that device for 3 years, that basically equates to 300 kilograms per year. So that's a little bit better, right, in terms of thinking about it. If you keep that device for 5 years, that's 180. And this is how the maths goes. So in terms of extending the lifespan of our devices and reducing the emissions from that, that's very important. But then there's another problem there as well, because is it really a hardware problem? When we're releasing software these days, it very often comes with high requirements. Sometimes people have to change devices because they can't run products anymore on their computers. Maybe people who play games, they've been through that, right? The new game is released, oh, I need a new computer. So it's a competitive world. We obviously all have to produce updates, but are we leaving people behind? And also very important is, do we buy equipment according to our technical needs? No offense to everybody, but probably if you're starting your coding journey to run a few lines of codes at the beginning, you don't need a super high-spec machine to get you started. You don't need to revamp your entire setup to get going. Okay, but what if you want to actually start measuring what you're doing? Like, this is all great, there are tools, but what about that? And the good news, again, is there's a lot of open source tools that you can start looking at, and I'm going to sort of scan through them quite briefly because they might be getting maybe a little bit too technical for some of people. But I was watching this Green Coding Berlin talk. This is their slide as well. They have this tool that you can sort of run your application through. They are able to actually analyze the impact of your backend services as well as your frontend services and output this very rather sophisticated and detailed dashboard of stats around the environmental health of your application. If you are not feeling like it's something you could do, maybe you can ask your senior developer, have they ever done anything like that? And you might actually catch some people's interest. And I did say we're not going to be looking at calculations today, but I just really wanted to flag this equation to people in case there are some people in the audience who would like to maybe taking a pic of. Again, this is by the Green Software Foundation. and that says software carbon intensity. And I'm just going to read this out because I fully agree with this, but the SCI score is a rate of carbon emissions, not a total. So from the beginning, you're not trying to calculate the overall emissions of your application, which can be quite daunting, but you're basically picking a rate. So this R at the end is your rate. So for example, for Zoom, this might be how much emissions do we release per minute of a call? For somebody who is building a software application, maybe they will say, how many emissions do we have per user? And how does that change as we keep adding users? Hopefully it should stay at constant. It might be increasing, it might be decreasing. So I do invite you to sort of revisit this after the talk. It's a very elegant solution to a very complex problem. But I do get it. This might be too much for some people. 100%, don't worry about it. Start small. There are some very simple sort of website carbon emissions calculators. They're not going to be extremely detailed. They will only probably look at sort of your front-end aspect of the website. But it might get you started to think about all of these things. And maybe it will even affect which website do you use. I'm getting there, I promise. So, what to consider? So, obviously, I said it at the beginning, I totally understand a lot of you are sort of junior developers, but I think there's a big power that is coming with it, because you can really just go in and start asking questions, right? And just expecting to more experienced people to give you those answers. So there are things you can ask around, computation. Are we using the right tool for the job? Have we considered serverless architecture? Even without knowing 100% what you're asking about, you can start triggering those things because people might get interested. Engineers, by definition, are quite interested people, so they might get curious. Questions around data transfer. Why are we using so much user tracking? This adds on to the loads of your page. It's getting heavier, it requires more emissions. Do we need all of these ads? Are all of these things we have on this website needed for the best user experience? And around data storage as well. Every time we store something, there's this physical hardware somewhere that is being, is getting another thing added to it, and that generates emissions. Ask about good data retention strategy. Are we deleting our data when we don't need it? And does everything need to be stored? Talk to your product managers. Maybe you should have an eco-mode version of your application that emits much less emissions and has much less added to it as well. And build with purpose. So I was going to say, there might be some of you here. I definitely was one of those people when I was learning to code. You might be writing a lot of code these days. You might be sending it up on GitHub just to get that green square, just to show that you're really doing it. And I would really invite you to maybe start shifting that thought of, you don't necessarily always have to prove that you have, written somewhere and send it up into the space. There will be, it's about trade-offs of 100%, so don't get me wrong, still submit your code and show people that you're coding, but it's about starting to conceptualize this a little bit more, that the resources, the digital resources we're using aren't infinite. They also have their impact. So tidy after yourself. When I was finishing school, I left all of my notebooks and all of my notes, and 5 years later I was moving houses and realized I never touched any of the notes from school I have ever written. Same for your digital footprint. I had some old Heroku accounts, old domains that I just kept keeping for no reason. So just think about it, tidy after yourself if you can. It's gonna reduce your carbon footprint as well. So in summary, climate change, unfortunately, is probably going to be a problem for the duration of your career. But you're not alone. A lot of people are already working on those problems and providing tools for you to use to become better. Questions you ask as a junior developer are important and can trigger change. Think about your digital footprint and don't treat it as an infinite resource, because one day it really might not be. Thank you very much.